Hi everyone, this is Intro to African History. I'm Dr. Young. We are going to begin our discussion, and this will take roughly half the course, of what I call pre-modern African history. That's not a term I invented, by the way, but the divisions between pre-modern and modern in African history are slightly different, say, than European history. Pre-modern is usually treated as the period before about 1800, really before the start of intense European involvement in the African continent. Again, there's that Eurocentric bias that we've talked about that even creates the divisions of African history. But there are other reasons to sort of call it pre-modern. We could perhaps invent other terms for this and say, this is the Aboriginal period of African history, where it's just the inhabitants of Africa who are, responsible for the human development and such. But we'll go ahead and stick with pre-modern here. And so this is going to take us all the way from very, very ancient times. You'll see how ancient in a minute here, to about 1800, and that, as I said, will constitute roughly half the course. And then, we'll in the second half of the course, we'll pick up from around 1800 on. The way that I tend to structure these classes is the way this class, I should say, is structured. I'll start with kind of giving an overview of major themes, and then we'll dig into those themes a little bit, and then we'll move on to the next set of themes or the next period of time, and hopefully all of that will make sense. So when we're talking about really, really ancient African history, and I'm talking from the beginning of the earliest human development in the evolutionary cycle, right, where human creatures began to evolve from similar species, various species of primates in Africa. Paleontologists, scientists have pushed this back further and further, to around probably 6 to 7 million BCE. Various species of humanoid creatures begin to evolve around that time, eventually differentiating from one another, probably evolving, some species evolving independently of each other. This is a class about history. This is not necessarily a paleontology class or a class about human evolution or anything, but it's important to say that took place in Africa, right? The first humans developed in Africa. New evidence comes to light quite frequently to revise our narrative of when human life left Africa. Some recent discoveries have shown that it's perhaps quite a bit earlier than we had supposed. Maybe going back into 1 million or 2 million years, when these species were still sort of evolving and competing with one another. From about 4 million to about 0.5 million years ago, we have these various species, as I said, competing with each other. There probably was some violence, but also some cross-mating of species. They were close enough in genetic terms to be able to mate with one another. We all have, the genetic material from other human species, as it were, in our DNA. And by about 0.5 million years or so ago, half a million years ago, Homo sapiens emerges as the dominant human species, and eventually really the only human species, right? And why that happened, again, is subject for debate. Did they kill off all of the other species, sort of outcompete them because they had bigger brains and greater capabilities? Was this, caused by other factors? It may have been, multiple things working at the same time, right? Now, when can we begin to talk about human beings existing and forming groups and societies and things like this, and beginning to work on tools and such? Well, probably a few 100,000 years ago, right? A quarter of a million years ago or so, and several things proceed from there, right? The out of Africa hypothesis, which I just discussed, which supposes that human life developed in Africa, and the Homo sapiens, evolved and differentiated themselves from all other humanoid species, and then left the continent eventually and went and settled other parts of the world. First, probably Asia, then moving into Europe, and eventually across the Bering Strait land bridge into the Americas, over the sea to places like Indonesia and Australia, and eventually pretty much all of the habitable space on Earth. Right. Maybe the best evidence that this did happen in Africa is not the skeletal remains of these Australopithecine species or others that we find, up to 6 or 7 million years ago, but rather the DNA evidence that demonstrates that a couple of groups of people who live currently in Africa or in modern times in Africa have. The evidence, and I'm not a geneticist certainly here, but the evidence shows that, all other human beings sort of developed from these groups, or rather they sort of have the earliest evolutionary DNA in them, right? And these two groups are the San, or the Khoisan people. There was a clique in that, by the way. This is a group in southern Africa, known sort of pejoratively to European scholars as the Bushmen, but San is really their proper name, and they have a click language, and I'll talk about click languages as this course goes on here. But the other one is the Biaka people of Central Africa, known again pejoratively as pygmies, but these two groups of people seem to have the DNA makeup that suggests at all that they are kind of the origin hominids, right? The origin Homo sapiens, and they certainly have intermarried and interbred with other later developed humans, but and this is not to say that these are different species or anything like that. Far from it. We are all human beings, but this group was rather self-contained for much of African history, and so they seem to be the earliest in sort of evolutionary terms, right? Another set of data, as it were, that demonstrates the out of Africa hypothesis is the evidence from tools. The earliest tool evidence comes from Africa, and the earliest human tools are simply given the very generic label hand axes. And they're called such because the earliest tools were roughly the size of a rock that could fit into the palm of one's hand, and the humans who produced these things chipped the rock to the point that it had some kind of edge to it, some kind of mechanism that could be used for a variety of things, for cutting or chopping, or perhaps as a weapon, certainly for digging, and probably pounding and crushing foods, and things like this. It was a multi-purpose tool. And hand axes go back, hundreds of thousands of years, or at least tens of thousands of years that we can determine. Now, a few tens of thousands of years ago, humans began to develop other types of tools that were more finely crafted, probably had more specialized uses. They tended to be smaller than the hand axe. You can see on the slide here on the bottom left that there is a picture of what looked like some spearheads or arrowheads. These are known as microliths, small stone tools, and they have much finer cutting edges. Certainly, they would have been, used for more precision work than a hand axe was. And so that evolutionary development from hand axes to microliths is an important sign of the development of sort of human capabilities with tools. But that happens in Africa, and I mean the earliest microliths are from African evidence, and that knowledge of using this type of tool seems to have spread out of Africa again. A few other themes here that are important. Language development. I am actually not sure. It's a few tens of thousands of years ago, but exactly when human beings, or approximately even when human beings began to develop language. But these languages were first developed in Africa, and certainly Africa has seen a great deal of language development. It's incredibly complex linguistically, almost more so than any other part of the world. I'm not, I don't have statistics in front of me, but Africa is breathtakingly diverse linguistically. And so I'll have more to say about that. And then this really important development that absolutely transforms human society, which is the development of agriculture and pastoralism. And again, Africa is the site of one of the earliest agricultural civilizations. That would be Egypt, which is developed roughly around the same time as agriculture in Western Asia. And they may have influenced each other to some extent. But also pastoralism, which I talked about in a previous class, the domestication of animals and the reliance on animals for their sustenance, and for varied uses, everything from riding them to using animal byproducts like milk and eggs. The earliest domesticated animal was the dog, and probably for several thousand years the dog was the only domesticated animal. That happened probably 15,000 years ago or so. The dog, of course, used as a hunting companion for hunter-gatherers. But eventually, the cow, the camel, the horse, and sheep and goats and chickens and other things in different parts of the world. So, this move away from hunting and gathering, with its absolute reliance on these stone tools that we've talked about, to a different type of economy, one that permitted, certainly with agriculture, permitted sedentary living, is perhaps the most fundamental transformation of human life in all of history, in all of the story of the human species, possibly only rivaled by the technological revolution of the modern age, which is profound, and we're right in the middle of it, and who knows where it's going to take us. But the agricultural revolution in what's known as the Neolithic period, the New Stone Age, is just this fantastic revolution that transforms human society irrevocably. Going along with that is the development of the use of metals. Up until about the late 3rd millennium BCE or so, all tools produced by humans were made of stone. And so we call this the Stone Age. We can even differentiate it into the Paleolithic or the Old Stone Age and the Neolithic or the New Stone Age. And those periods roughly correspond with this dividing line between the hunter-gatherer societies and the agricultural/pastoral societies. And in the Neolithic period, as people move to agriculture and move to pastoralism, their tools change. They're no longer just for hunting or digging. They become increasingly specialized. grinding stones and sickles and other things that are necessary for both for agriculture and for the transforming of the foodstuffs into some kind of edible and bioavailable substance, right? But about 2000 BCE or so, humans begin to turn to metals for making tools. Now, metals are abundantly available, but they often are, well, they pretty much invariably are housed in ore, which means the metal is, of course, combined with rock. And so it took some time for humans to figure out how to extract the metal from the rock. It usually involves heating these things up to high temperatures. Copper, it seems, was more available, or rather, it was more available. It was easier to extract, and so it begins with copper. Copper is then combined with some other metals, with tin, and those two together with a bonding agent like arsenic produce bronze. And so Egypt from the 3rd millennium BCE or so has bronze. It's one of the earliest Bronze Age civilizations. It's not until sometime in the perhaps the late 2nd millennium or early 1st millennium BCE that human beings begin to use iron. Even though iron ore is relatively abundant, it's difficult to extract from the ore. It takes fantastically high temperatures. You can't just light a fire and stick the piece of iron ore in there and expect it to purify. Expect it to smelt. You've got to have an enclosed furnace, pump air into it, heat the fire, and certain kind of fuel, probably a coal rather than just a wood, and heat it up to really, really high temperatures to extract the iron from the impurities of the ore. And Africans figured this out. Now, with agriculture / pastoralism and metallurgy, the big debate in African history is, how did this happen? Did it begin in one place and diffuse from there to the rest of the continent? Or did different centers on the continent develop these technologies independently of each other, right? And some of the hypotheses that have been formulated to explain this have, contained within them some kind of, I think, Eurocentric bias again, suggesting that Africans could not possibly have come up with these things on their own, that it had to be some advanced civilization like the one in Egypt or the one in Mesopotamia or something that, spread these ideas to sub-Saharan Africa. But I think that the evidence is not clear, and actually the diffusion hypothesis from Egypt is more problematic than other probable explanations. Okay, so let's look a little more closely at each of those themes. First of all, language families. And I want you to be familiar with this because this has a real impact on African history. The different language groups that develop, or language families that develop, the contact between these different language families, all of this has a tremendously important impact on the way African societies are formed, the kinds of technologies they develop, the way they're able to eke out an existence from the land. There are four major language families in Africa, and that's not even to include the Austronesian language family, which predominates in Madagascar. Again, I'm not really going to treat Madagascar in this course. At the north here, the northern part of Africa, all of this land in blue. And by the way, these national divisions are, I think it goes without saying, are totally irrelevant for this period we're talking about, right? This very early period of African history. This northern part, all this stuff in blue, is home to the Afro-Asiatic language family, which includes subfamilies like the Climatic languages of northeastern Africa, and some of the Semitic languages like Arabic, for instance, and Amharic and Oromo, and the Berber languages, and some of these that predominate in North Africa. Now, it seems that around Lake Chad, this region here in what is now the Sahara, there first developed what we call the Nilo-Saharan language family. And these spread, and the path of spread is important here, right? They developed around Lake Chad, and they spread to the south and east. There are pockets of Nilo-Saharan speakers over here in West Africa as well. But that movement is really important, and I'll explain why that movement occurred on the next slide, I believe. And then the largest language family is called the Niger-Congo language family. After the two rivers here, because this first developed probably between the two rivers, perhaps here in what is now Cameroon. That seems to be the kind of origin place for the Niger-Congo. And it spread both to the west up here, developing into what is known as the Niger-Congo A language subfamily, and to the south and east over here, developing into what is known as the Niger-Congo B language family, otherwise known, by the way, as the Bantu language family. And this is one of the most prolific of all language families on Earth. Literally hundreds, if not thousands, of different dialects or different languages that are part of the Bantu language family. And this hints at this long period of migration, which we will talk about soon in this course. Okay. The other major language family is probably the origin language of Africa, though it's maybe somewhat uncertain. But this is the Khoisan. Again, there's a click in that. Okay, and this language family is characterized by clicks. Pretty much all of the languages in this language family have clicks in them, and in fact are made up mostly of clicks. Okay, rather than consonants. Speakers of these languages will use their tongue pressing on various parts of their mouth to form these clicks. They can differentiate between numerous styles of clicks. When I lived in Africa, I did learn how to do some clicks, but because some of the Bantu languages, as the Bantu peoples migrated further and further to the south here, they encountered the Khoisan people and took from them or borrowed from them some of these clicks, so that languages like Ndebele and Zulu and Xhosa do have clicks in them, okay, but only a few. Zulu, for instance, has 3 clicks. Briefly, they are ha, ha, and ha. And you note that I put a vowel on the end of each of those clicks. You could also put a different vowel. You could say ha, ha, ti, ho, hu, and ha, ha, ti, ho, hu, and ha, ha, ti, ho, hu. Okay, and there will be a test at the end of all of this. I need to make sure that you all learn how to click. No, I'm just kidding. But the clicks, because as the Bantu spread, they run into these Khoisan, and they borrow some of the clicks from them, or rather they diffuse, so they're mutually influential. There are still a few Khoisan speakers left, but the vast majority of these people were either hunter-gatherers or pastoralists, and most of them have been absorbed kind of into the surrounding populations. There are really very few or no San left living the traditional hunting and gathering lifestyle at this point. Climate has a huge impact on this really ancient history, and we're dealing with vast swaths of time here, as you'll see. From about 30,000 BCE, humans by that point had developed language, and were living in hunter-gatherer groups, and eking out an existence from whatever they could find in terms of animals and roots and berries and edible plants, to about 12,000 BCE or so, where we may see the first stirrings of agriculture, though probably that's a little bit early. But this was a cool, dry period. Temperatures were probably lower on average than they are in more recent times. It was also quite dry, and so the bodies of the bodies of water that are have waxed and waned over time were probably um, uh, fairly seriously truncated because of the lack of rainfall. For that 20,000 or so year periods, peoples in Africa were living as hunter-gatherers. Okay, now from about 10,000 BCE to about the middle of the 6th millennium BCE, there is this wet period. Okay, temperatures were they heated up, and there was a tremendous amount of rainfall. By the way, this cool dry period corresponds to some extent with the last ice age, and there probably were glaciers and things, in parts of Africa. There still are glaciers on some of the high mountains up here that border the Great Rift Valley, like Kilimanjaro is famous for its glaciers. So they have mostly disappeared at this point, given global warming and all of that. But this wet period sees a tremendous amount of rainfall. The Sahara in this period was not the dry, foreboding desert that it is at present. It probably was a fairly sustainable and arable piece of Earth, at least parts of it were. And as you can see from this map here, and this is just conjecture to some extent, but two bodies of water were vastly larger than they are today. One of these is Lake Chad, which is nearly dried up at this point, and it may, if global warming continues, dry up completely in the next few years, or the next few decades, I should say. But Lake Chad was gigantic. Okay, and the same thing for the rainforest region here. The Congo River probably spread over its banks and developed, and flooded the surrounding countryside, developing into a lake that we might call Lake Congo. And so Africa, the whole of the interior of the continent here was covered by these vast bodies of water. And it's probably on the shores of Lake Chad that the first domestication of plants and animals took place outside of Egypt. Egypt was developing these things around the same time as was Western Asia over here, the Fertile Crescent. But these were developed along Lake Chad. Now, did this diffuse from Egypt down here into the Sahara? Possibly. It may have gone the other direction, though. Okay. The other thing is that the peoples who lived along Lake Chad here, and these are, by the way, if we go back to the last slide, the Nilo-Saharan speakers. So around Lake Chad, they began to domesticate plants and animals. That doesn't mean that they immediately, developed sedentary agricultural societies. Hunter-gatherers, probably for hundreds, if not thousands of years, knew how to domesticate the plants and animals, but still saw a need to move around. It takes a real kind of leap of imagination to say, hey, we could just stay here and not have to move when humans were so accustomed to moving places. The other key piece of the economy of these early African societies was fishing. Because there were these huge bodies of water, because the land was quite wet, there were lots of opportunities to fish, and they developed their tools to take advantage of the fishing opportunities. We find fish hooks and other things in the archaeological evidence from these regions. Okay, now from about 5,000 BCE on, really extending all the way to the present, there has been this climate shift. Africa and, in fact, the rest of the world dried up. Africa was not the only place that experienced this. You may have heard talk of Lake Bonneville, for instance, which was a vast inland sea in the Great Basin region of the United States. The only thing that's really left of Lake Bonneville is the Great Salt Lake. But there are salt flats out there in around the Great Salt Lake, which are the leftover parts of that inland sea that used to cover this huge stretch of land. And so, Africa is sort of in keeping with other parts of the world in this trend. Now, when the Sahara begins to dry up, we call this the desiccation of the Sahara, Lake Chad no longer could sustain the population of human beings with their agriculture, with their domesticated animals, with their reliance on fishing that it had previously. And so a lot of these people began to move to the south and the east, down here into regions where agricultural opportunities were better, right? And with them diffused the knowledge and technology that they had developed up here, okay? So again, back to the map here, you can see that the Nilo-Saharan speakers moved down here into what is now Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, down into the Great Lakes region here, right? And it's this contact in the Great Lakes region between the Nilo-Saharan and the Bantu speakers that is absolutely vital for the development of human societies in Africa. Again, back to the linguistic map here, you'll see that the Bantus, and we'll talk about the migration of the Bantus, I think in the next lecture, or maybe 2 lectures from now, but the Niger-Congo speakers originate over here in probably Cameroon, and the B family, the Bantu family, moves over here, skirting the top of the rainforest. This is a very gradual migration. I talked about this in a previous lecture, right? That these people move just piecemeal, a few miles at a time, probably until they encounter virgin land. Or in this case, the Bantus probably started out as hunter-gatherers. Once they reached this place and then and started to interact with the Nilo-Saharan speakers, well, this technology, the knowledge of how to farm or how to domesticate plants and how to use domesticated animals and how to produce tools that could be used for fishing effectively and all of that, moved from the Nilo-Saharan speakers to the Bantu. How do we know this? Well, because in these Bantu languages there are Nilo-Saharan words, Nilo-Saharan roots for words that are associated with agriculture, with pastoralism, with fishing, with tool making, and other things. And so it's from the linguistic evidence that we can discern this important interaction, right? That area, the Great Lakes area spreading over here into Ethiopia, right? This area is one of the richest in terms of, the development of human societies, of civilizations. It's one of the most, as I've said before, one of the most densely populated regions of Africa. And so that contact zone is tremendously important, historically, technologically, and otherwise. Now, what does this tell us about the development of agriculture? Well, it's probably that, agriculture, even if it started in Egypt and diffused down here to Lake Chad, which may not be the case, it may have developed here independently, that seems to be more likely. But even if it started in Egypt, that it took on a life of its own as people moved. And the lands down here in the Great Lakes region are vastly different from the Nile Valley. And so even if they, were armed with agricultural knowledge that they gained, ultimately from the peoples of North Africa, they had to develop their own ways of farming down here because the land was so different crops, different ways probably of planting and harvesting and other things, right? So Africans were responsible for a great deal of innovation here. Okay, I think that I want to stop because we're going to move on and talk about some of these ancient civilizations, talk about ancient Egypt and others in the next lecture.